This event is hosted by the Sustainable Built Environment Group, in which I'm a research fellow. And this currently sits in the School of Architecture, Design and Construction, and in the new faculty system will be found in the Faculty of Architecture, Computing and Humanities. It's also supported by London Sustainability Exchange. Our group tends to focus on issues of climate, mitigation and adaptation of existing built and lived environments, like social housing and local authorities. In this context, awkward localism is an exploration of the politics of the everyday, development, and the newest regimes of planning and neighbourliness. Awkward localism is more nebulous than bureaucratically contained governance and issue selections, but it does intersect. Buildings and planning policies struggle to keep up with faddish and often schizophrenic policies, detuned from their original intentions and insulated from sensible concerns by the power of modern organisation. We see how modern buildings designed to require less energy to perform and reduce our climate impacts become cookers in the hot summer weather. On a recent survey visit to some sheltered accommodation in West London, a jolly and exasperated building manager took me to a meeting room where healthcare professionals were sweltering with both with fans and electric heaters on, and oblivious to what was going on. And I thought this was a perfect image for the business of sustainability. Defining awkward localism kind of makes it a lot less fun, but I venture that it's politics of sight that connects concerns which become disconnected and discounted from each other. Most localisms are, I would argue, if there was room on the form. One big example would be the Olympic site. The radioactively contaminated land there, the regeneration projects, the decanting, that kind of stuff. The objectives of today are to network and learn from each other's take on the idea. And this idea has multiple points of entry, as you can see from the programme. We unpick these awkward localisms today from Deptford's colonial past and present to an Italian movement to re-municipalise public water infrastructure, a refugee camp of stranded Pakistanis in Bangladesh, and community gardens in the Bronx. In the third part of the programme, we draw the conversation nearer again, and we hear from regeneration battlegrounds in Lewisham, the struggle against air fouling, car use, and explore novel post-NIMBYist ways in which the citizen might engage with the planning process. Refreshments will be outside. There'll be sandwiches and stuff around 4, a round of coffee and tea and biscuits after the next question and answer. Washrooms can be found outside, obviously in case of fire, get out of the room. Feel free to submit to command and control operations. No fire drills today, and just want to introduce our next speaker, John Hutnyk, who is academic director of the Centre for Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths College, and convener of MAs in both creating social media and critical Asian studies. He's got research interests in revolutionary movements, especially South Asia, global knowledge production, and the history of ideas, trinkets, architectural style, and urbanism. Quite a lot, actually. Today he's going to speak on the matter of basically a development in Deptford and unwind the history and learning politics around it.
Sorry. Okay, hi. Thanks for coming. I'm really glad you found me, or I found you, or whatever. This seems like a really appropriate connection for the kind of mess of a paper that I've been struggling with for a while to get together into a coherent narrative. So apologies for using you as a sounding board, an experimental box in which to try and present this jumble of things, which is kind of my interest in NIMBY campaigns, which goes back some 30 years, my interest in Marx, which is, with mother's milk, and my family anyway, and an obsession with India and Calcutta, the revolutionary movement, so the politics there, the city of Calcutta, and of course our location, which is, well, just down the road from this. And I want to try and talk our way from this, the East India Company's shipyard, or the King Dock in Deptford, to the bright shining future offered to us in this, the Hutchinson-Whampoa Development Plan, currently under, well, seeking approval from. A few flashcards though for the context. I'm not going to say much about these things because you'll know them, but they're to help me think about what the context is. And it's the uprising, London riots or whatever of 2011 in August, and the death of Mark Duggan. I could go through a list of those killed in police custody. But I think of that as part of the context. The criticism of Rupert Murdoch by Johnny Marbles, using a pie, at the Leveson inquiry, because that was a part of it. The Prime Minister going off to sell weapons, to an arms trade affair in the Middle East, and stopping on the way in not quite Tahrir Square. Near. He went near. He went sort of close to Tahrir Square during the Egyptian Revolution. Occupy, I suppose, the Arab Spring followed by a Libyan winter. That is noted. And more recent things. This is becoming fascinating right now, right? So the rebels the citizens concerned with the regeneration project in Gezi were described as looters by the Prime Minister Erdogan. And now already the culture industry is so swift on the mark, we're about to get released a new beer in Turkey called Looter beer. It's quite fantastic. These bizarre things I think are useful for me because they hold global cultural phenomena and people's movement together in an awkward relation. But I start instead with a Prime Minister of this country, Benjamin Disraeli, who wrote in the same year that Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, not when it was published, it wasn't published until the next year, well actually much of it was written the next year, but in the same year that the manifesto was being drafted by Marx and Engels, he wrote this text, Tancred, or the New Crusade. And I want to quote from that. It's near the beginning, an early scene in the novel, and there's a dinner party where the great and the good are assembled, members of the parliament and officials. And they're sending off the young Lord Montagu. And he's about to, there are two old chaps talking about him off to the side. Wonderful fellow, Montagu. You cannot conceive of nothing richer. He's very wild. He has all the right ideas. Exaggerating, of course. You must get hold of him after dinner. But they say he's going to Jerusalem. He will return. I don't know that. Even Napoleon regretted that he had ever recrossed the Mediterranean. The East is a Korea. Disraeli made the East a Korea. You will know that his is significant for very long speeches in the Parliament. A 3-hour speech on the occasion of what he calls the mutiny, the Indian Mutiny in 1857. The first war of Indian independence, Marx calls the Great Rebellion. I'm interested in this. So, Marx, his commentaries on India. I want to take this eventually to Deptford, right, and try and hold these two places together at the same time. This is my awkward bit, right? That I don't think we can think, I don't think we can think of around with crap in this sentence. I don't think that we can think of these places without pulling together somehow, because they're connected. And they're connected in ways that I think Marx gives us a clue for thinking about. A bit of a clue. In his notes on Indian history, he talks about that mutiny, that great rebellion, First War of Independence, and he criticises Disraeli's speech for having said nothing. In fact, being a perfect example of parliamentary boring, withering on, managing to say nothing. When what was going on in this rebellion was a moment of retribution. Marx comments on this. He puts in the context when he's writing these notes on Indian history in the last years of his life. Jumping from 1847 when he writes the manifesto to the last years of his life too quickly, and I want to hold these things together as well. He writes in a way that kind of develops his view of India from first recognizing that colonialism was bringing something to the subcontinent, to a more nuanced reading that recognizes that the subcontinent has something to teach Europe itself. He says very interesting things in this regard. And he quotes in the notes on Indian history a section from Horace, from the Satires. You'll forgive my Latin, it's really crap. Mutato nomine de te fabula narratur. It's a sentence that he uses in the beginning in the preface to Capital. He uses it once more in Capital, and then it comes up in the notes. And it's a really interesting one. Mutato nomine de te fabula narratur. Is anyone good at Latin? It used to be a requirement at university, right? It still is a requirement in some universities. In Germany, they do it. They still do it. In Germany, they do this, and some of the students worked it out. Right, conjugated it. Interestingly, I was in the South Asian Institute, where you could either get into the university if you had Latin or Sanskrit in Heidelberg. It's weird. There are about 60 speakers of Sanskrit in Heidelberg. That's probably more than most cities in Europe. Anyway, I can do it for you. Okay, mutato nomine de te fabula. The story changes, but the narrative is told of you. And I think this is great. So Marx is taking this from Horace, and it's a text that follows, a sentence that follows someone saying, "What are you laughing at?" And Marx is laughing at this retribution. And he says in the part of Capital, section 10, chapter 10, section 3, where he uses this, that for slave trade, read labour market. For Kentucky and Virginia, read Ireland and the agriculture districts of England, Scotland and Wales. For Africa, Germany. And you're seeing this similar pattern, the story unfolding. Elsewhere, he wants the German worker, in the preface, he wants the German workers to think of his story about capital England as something that is happening to them. And then, in the notes on Indian history, it goes further. And he gives us what I'll call, and I'll just hold it again, another Latin marker, right? This is the posh bit, the Latin bit. I won't do this much more. Quid pro quo, right? Which is a sort of distortion of Shakespeare. Marx loved his Shakespeare. He'd walk through Hampstead Heath with his kids, reciting it and so on. The quid pro quo is that anyway, we don't have to go into all the footnotes about this. Let's stop this. In Notes on Indian History, Marx is talking about, in one section, a fantastic little episode, the black hole in Calcutta. Many people know about the black hole in Calcutta. It's kind of a great metaphor. We're talking about things like crowded trains or a whole series of things. How many people know it was a British prison? One.
Yeah.
The story is weirdly distorted. Right? The story is that Siraj-ud-Dowlah locked up 120 or 47, or maybe it was just 5, maybe they were dead already, soldiers from the Calcutta fort in the so-called black hole. after Siraj had come down from Calcutta and sacked the city. Now, Siraj-ud-Dowlah was the local ruler, the Nawab of Bengal. He was a young lad, 21 years of age. And the British had been building up their fort, which included the prison hole, the prison of the Black Hole. It was a room, maybe, I don't know what, 16 feet. About 16 feet by 9 foot square. So big. I have no idea. They locked up 147 souls in there, some say. Anyway, this British guardhouse, effectively, only had one small window, and Siraj, when his troops sacked the city, drove the British out, and they fled. They fled by boat. It seems they fled by boat well before the fort fell, but anyway, that's another detail of the story. Siraj is said to have locked everyone up, including some young women, and by the morning, it was the hottest day of the monsoon, the winds blow, all this romantic stuff. In the morning there was only 18 or 19 people left alive. Partha Chatterjee has a great book out last year called The Black Hole of History, where he assembles many of the factual records of the time. Now, he leaves out a few, but I think it's a fantastic book and I recommend it. But he kind of assembles all the argument of the past years, like McDowell and McFairlane and a few, that raise questions about the veracity of this story. Right? You couldn't get 147 people into a room this big. The only report we have of the incident was by a guy called Holwell, who became the later Viceroy of the East India Company, head of Bengal. He wrote his account of it 8 months later, some 2 months after the Battle of Plassey, where Lord Clive came and destroyed about 3,000 of Siraj's troops in retribution. And actually, Marx, not knowing the detail, reading Charles Sewell's History of British India and taking notes. On the day before photocopy, you had to handwrite things out. Marx is taking notes and he writes down this story and receives Holwell's story well before Chatterjee, right? And you see his, Marx's, what do we call these? He's taking the notes, but his annotations are the ones in italics in this text, right? Where's the important bit? Siraj gave, say 4 lines down, Siraj gave orders that all the captives should be kept in safety till the morning. Right? He's starting to exonerate Siraj, even when he's writing just in 1881, 79, 81. They were allowed, everybody else, only 23 were still alive the next morning. They were allowed to go. Where else is it? Bengal now completely and effectively cleared of the English intruders. This is a decisive action. Siraj-ud-Dowlah restored the company to their old privileges. Clive recaptures this. Marx comments on this black hole as he calls it a sham scandal. A sham scandal of which the English hypocrites have been making so much cant all these years. Why? Because Clive, we've got some maps. This is the scene, all right? Calcutta here. Important context. Calcutta is a developing trading port. It's small. There are 5 other national camps trading. The Dutch, the Portuguese, the Danes, the French, and the English. The Chinese have even got a settlement. A small one. And they're trading on this bend in the Hooghly. And at this stage, British power is not really a big player. It's Clive that comes in after Siraj has sacked Calcutta. It transforms this city into transformed British interests in India. That's why we put statues up of him in outside the old India office, Foreign Office. the steps, the Clive steps in Whitehall, right? It's very easy to see. It looks a bit too grandiose there. Where are the steps? It's not that big. But, Clive and the British had been building fortifications at the fort outside the Black Hole. Siraj said, "You are guests." Siraj Abdullah said, "You are guests in this state, in Bengal, and under my jurisdiction. You will cease and desist." Effectively, he said, "Stop building the forts, otherwise we'll force you out." They refused. He came down. Clive raises an army with the East India Company's resources and ships built just from here in Deptford, and comes out with reinforcements in the army. Within 6 months, has both driven out the French from Shaninagar, which was one of the settlements on the bend in the Hooghly, which was always part of the plan. Remember, they'd been building fortifications not to protect themselves from Siraj Abdullah, but to set up a monopoly of the trade in Bengal. And they had confronted Siraj and dethroned him and replaced him with Mir Jafar. Mir Jafar was one of his generals who was loyal until they made a deal with Clive, and halfway through the battle of Palashi, as it's known in Bengal, he stops fighting, steps back, stops fighting, goes to Clive's camp. Siraj Abdullah is defeated and then murdered by Jafar. And all the privileges of the company are restored, and they're allowed to rebuild the fort. Erasing the Black Hole. Actually, no historical record, no contemporary record of the Black Hole until after the Battle of Palashi, after the Restoration, in fact, months after, and after Holwell himself rebuilt it. So if you look at the Gentleman's Magazine of July 1757, which is after this event and tells the story of Palashi, no mention whatsoever. The documents, this is such a beautiful book, one of these, I'm a bit obsessed with the trinkets and the objects. One of these cloth-covered thing, gold inlaid. I can't actually bring it out of the library to show you, but you get the idea. This is the Indian Record Series, Bengal, 1756, 1767. And it's the records, all the records that we have, published in 1902 by the Indian Office, documenting this. Nothing mentioned in the contemporary records. But here's Clive doing his deal with Mir Jafar in a contemporary rendering, a portrait, with all of the appropriate exoticist kind of character to it. Everyone dressed. Like if you're dealing to betray the Nawab, Master of Service, you're probably not going to do it in a crowd of 20 people. Anyway, but this is just a representation and by the by. That's why Clive gets his statue. The reason I'm doing this, we're talking about this in such detail, is because this black hole, right? It's a British-built prison, and it's a British-built story. It's a ideological, after the event, justification. Nehru Chowdhury has commented on this, and McFarlane, as I said, and Convoys Wharf. But not only because I'm obsessed with the black hole as a metaphor, the way in which we keep on using it without all the historical, it's phantasmagoric character. But because there's something about the retribution moment that Marx then comments on again. Elsewhere. It's a curious quid pro quo to expect an Indian revolt to assume the features of a European revolution. It is a rule of historical retribution that its instrument be forged not by the offended, but by the offender. Marx is not writing about the black hole here, not about the prison. He's writing about what happens in the mutiny that Disraeli gives that 3-hour speech about and says nothing. Right? The so-called mutiny, the Indian rebellion. That it's the sepoys that begin the rebellion, and they march to Delhi, and they ask the British installed Nawab of Delhi to lead in the national movement. Fantastic. So in 1857, I was just commenting on this 3-hour speech, but his automatic, and this is what I'm trying to work out, his automatic at the time, his automatic solidarity is with critical support for the rebels. I mean, he thinks they're making strategic and tactical errors and so on, has a commentary on their military tactics, but he's absolutely fascinated with what they're doing, and he falls immediately into a position of solidarity against the British. And curiously, this is part of his practice, Marx's practice, right? He writes something anticipating uprising. There is an uprising, so an example would be the Communist Manifesto, already mentioned, 1847, and then within months, well, it comes out it's written in, finished in February 48, it comes out in March. Within months, Europe is in revolt. The 1848 revolution, the June uprisings, and so on. Brutally put down and defeated. Marx makes some attempts to support all the refugees that are flooding. He's also exiled himself to England and spends time looking after the displaced, but then goes back to the library to try and work out what went wrong. In a similar way, the crisis of 1856, nearly 10 years later, gives Marx this hope that there will be another set of uprisings, that the old mole of revolution is popping its head up again, and well, Rob the old mole, he says, and there's hope for. It doesn't eventuate. In Europe, it certainly doesn't. The crisis in Europe is a monetary one, and some capital goes to the wall, but actually the uprising itself happens in India. It's the Great Rebellion. And he sees that, he talks about it in the terms of the June days in Europe. He talks about sentences from his 18th Brumaire, which is his analysis of the events in Europe, especially in France, between 1848 and 52, the reprise of Napoleon, the emergence of Louis the little nephew, the repetition of, you know the phrase, history happens, Hegel says somewhere that history happens, all events in history happen twice. He forgets to add second time is farce. First is tragedy, then is farce. Napoleon III, who becomes the emperor of the Third Republic, is an example. So Marx quotes from that to talk about, do you want awkward? Do you want?
No, yes.
Sorry. Imagine if I'm talking about Marx and Napoleon, that really go. People looking for something in my backyard.
Sorry.
Not my backyard. Napoleon was there, and he was worried. Marx was worried about India. God, so he's looking for the revolution in Europe, and he's thinking what's happening in India, and he's comparing the two, and then he comes with this statement, as in response to Disraeli giving this speech, which gives no analysis. He's basically saying that the political scientist is failing to give the kind of analysis that we need to understand it's the crisis in Europe and the uprising in India have to be held together. They can only make sense if you hold these things together. Because Marx is continually reworking, right? He's 1857, he sees this possible uprising, but it's also defeated. Within 2 years, the British have retained and restored all of their privileges again in India. Disraeli becomes a leader again. And Marx hits the books to try and work out what went wrong again. Always this pattern. Let's just point this out. Always this pattern. Writing and optimism for the revolution, the practice of engagement. Marx, there's newspapers, he supports the activists, he and Engels. Engels always goes off riding on his horse, sometimes practicing to keep fit in the lean years by doing riding to hounds. But he is also fighting in the June in the cavalry in June in Essen. Marx then kind of seems to, by habit, go back to the library to try and work out what happened. So in 1857, he writes what we know now as the Grundrisse, the groundwork for the opus that becomes Capital. Here's an example of Marx writing, thinking It's from the German ideology, it's not the right thing, but I quite liked all the caricatures of the different figures of the revolution that he's got in here. 1867, Marx does a similar thing. But he publishes volume 1 of Capital, the great book, the masterwork, the one book that he really finished and got out. Well, there's a couple of the main one. Part 1 of a series of 6. We've got part 1. Engels edited a couple others, and Kautsky kind of gathered everything together. But even here, this is Marx's own copy of the first page of Capital. Even here, within 5 years of having worked for 15 or 20 years on his economic shit, as he called it, Marx is already revising, as you see, his own text. And even the first sentence, you can get into the first sentence a lot if you want. The riches of society, quote of Adam Smith, isn't it? Wealthy nations, riches of society, in which the capitalist mode of production, Herrscht, the English says prevails, but Herrscht is more like dominates. Erscheint as, the Penguin translation has appears as, but Erscheint has this other apparition-like spectral quality. Erscheinungsform form means like it puts in an appearance as if on a stage. It appears to you as. An ungeheurer Warensammlung. The English has immense collection of commodities, but ungeheurer is not immense, it's monstrous. A monstrous accumulation. Right? But still, even though with that sentence that sort of says so much about what capital is about, commodity fetish and phantasmagoria and so on, Marx is already within 5 years of it coming out, revising. And he massively revises it. In fact, the edition that we read is the 4th German edition. Not unrecognisable for the first, but if you compare the two, chapter order's different, whole sections have been added, bits are condensed and changed. What happened between 1867 and 1872 that would make Marx rewrite? Pop quiz, audience participation time.
Franco-Prussian War.
Franco-Prussian War and the Paris Commune. From here you listed in the front. But yeah, the two have to go together. The Paris Commune, Marx rewrites for a serialization in French for the French workers. His text, he rethinks it in the context of. But of course, Capital is not just a text for the workers to provide them with the X-ray vision to see through the trick of commodity fetishism, which of course it is, but it's also a critique of the failure of the political scientists to give an adequate analysis of capital. And what capital is and how it moves and how it shifts. And especially how it shifts value. And so the crucial, we can debate about what's the crucial part of capital. But for me, the crucial part of capital is section 8, primitive accumulation. Right? It's the plunder of the world based on historical appropriation written in annals of blood and fire, he says, which is this theft of value from the rest of the world. It operates through, in large part, the political economists that Marx is criticising. Remember, it's a, can we go back one? No, it's not the front page. I thought I might have had the title. The title, the subtitle of Capital is a critique of political economy, and all through the texts he's pretty aggressive about the political economists. He doesn't like them, right? He calls them the learned professors and so on, in this mocking tone. He means Malthus. He means Richard Jones. He means Ricardo. But Malthus and Richard Jones, the professors of political economy, teach here in Haileybury. Well, this is what's called Haileybury now. It was the East India School. It was where professors of political economy taught the administrators of the East India Company. So Marx's Capital, every time I look at it now, everywhere I look at it, and I see this East India Company bubbling up. At every key moment in Capital, there's this eruption of his interest in how capital is operating globally, and especially in South Asia. But also remember, he's writing at the same time his journalism, critiques of Disraeli, and so on about the East India Company, and he's writing letters to Lincoln about how it's great. In 1863, he writes a letter of support saying, "Your second election is fantastic. The proclamation can now be pushed forward. The freed slaves can be freed." I mean, critical support. You can see there's also a little bit of a tone of cynicism. The workers of Europe think you're their leader. Marx is never going to go for that. But he writes a Lincoln response through his secretary. Interesting. Didn't make it into the Spielberg movie. Snippet, but you know, I was reminded at least. Marx is writing his journalism, making a critique of the learned professors, and he's seeking out value, the secret of value in value extraction. My problem with this is he's in London. It's really weird. Surely, if he was interested in value extraction, right, the secret of commodity fetish, the secret of capital, is this expropriation of value from the workers, but also from the globe. Why didn't he go in India for a look? Why didn't he write Capital in a very similar building, the old Metcalfe Library, built by one of the viceroys? And the viceroys loved building things with all their capital, but they brought a lot of loot home as well. Of course, this is Metcalfe's on Hastings, made it. Hastings, interesting, the guy that restored Holwell's monument to the Black Hole. There's a whole other story about the monument that needs to, its restoration, its disappearance from the historical record for about 90 years. There was no monument to this fictional, to this event. But Hastings restores it after Holwell's monument was made out of bricks and only lasted 40 years. Anyway, they build these things. But what do they bring back? Marxists look, they extract value. West Bengal is the richest part of India. India before Clive was the richest manufacturing sector in the world. Well, scholars say this now, right? That maybe 1/4 of all manufacture was happening in India in the 1770s. Within 50 years, that economy, salt, weaving, saltpeter, indigo, various other products, is destroyed and replaced by two things. Manchester cloth, which Marx comments on endlessly, Manchester cloth being sent to India, and the opium trade. The opium trade actually goes back to the Dutch in that bend on the river. But the opium trade is something that Clive and later Hastings latched right onto with the facility of Mir Jafar. Remember him, the betrayer. Right? He facilitates the opium trade. The opium trade opens up China to the East India Company. It gives them something to sell to the Chinese, get the hook on the dragon, in exchange for tea, which they bring back here and store up in the boxes that you can go and see in the Greenwich. What's this? Black hole of a boat over there. Yes. You know what's saying. It's fake, isn't it? It's rebuilt and it's not in this hollow building. What else do they bring back? Well, they bring back the opium, don't they? They bring back wealth. Wealth. In the famine year, Bengal is hit by famines. Massive. There's 17 famines in the historical record before the British came, and 41 in the period of the East India Company rule up until 1857, when the British take it over. Partly because they're in the process of destroying the economy. Clive brings back in 1871 over £1 million, £500,000 of profit that year himself. In today's money, that's like crazy. Crazy amounts of wealth. And he builds Palace Castle. And he brings back all sorts of booty as well. But the East India Company officials, in a fratricidal battle for control of the company, criticise him and divest him of his membership and his opportunity to make profit. He's home, and Marx comments on this. I've got the slides out of order. He brings back Tipu's slippers, but much else. Clive suicides in the wake of the criticisms from the East India Company. Quid pro quo. The vehicle of retribution is fashioned by the oppressor. And I'm interested in exactly this moment. Because yes, the slippers come back, but the opium does too. And these guys, the opening up of the China market is of great interest now. And as I come to my end, you'll see why I've been talking about this as the prehistory of that site there in Deptford. These are the gentlemen, Thomas Sutherland Douglas Clow, this guy here. He's a very fine model of a modern major general, isn't he? Look at him. So I couldn't get a bigger photo without him going out of focus. Douglas LePrey. And these two down here, Jardine and Matheson. We actually don't know which one's which. We know they're Jardine and Matheson, and they were the people who took over the opium trade from the East India Company in 1833. So these are the opium trade isn't just the legit trade that comes in the ship, like the clipper over there. It's also all the country trade, the in-country trade, and all the deals and bribes and so on that go on behind around that. Very important that every legal, formal part of capital also has a hinterland, a massive hinterland of illicit and informal trade. Very important to understand. These two things go together. Who else we got here? Oh, and chappie at the end is the current owner of the company that was Jardine Matheson and the Whampoa and Kowloon dock trading company. He is the 8th richest man in the world. He took over 30 years ago, Li Ka-shing, and his family has control of the company now known as Hutchinson Whampoa. They made their money, some detail there, opium houses in this trade. They make their money from construction, shipping, ports, construction, gas cylinders, telecommunications, mining, satellite technology, the 3G that you've got in your phone is them, and statistical management services. Hutchinson Whampoa. Where does that sound familiar? They are the ones going to redevelop the site that used to belong to Rupert Murdoch, this Convoys Wharf site, which is where I started. Convoys Wharf site, there's, okay, I haven't even told you the story about the Russian Tsar and his guard, but maybe some of you know about that, but that's a different story. They did a little bit of an archaeological dig and found this the dock where the King's Yard dock, where the East India Company ships were being built. So we've got that, but we're going to concrete it over because really we want 3,500 condos. This part of town. The only extant building, a warehouse from 1840, this lovely site, which, here's the view of it from just down here at the bottom of the, across the river. This is what it's going to look like. You see the silhouette. A couple of big towers with a hotel and all fully functional, multifunctional people living environment. The 3,500 condos. Some of them, of course, there's some social housing. But my bit was I wanted to show you this building. All right, 3,500 units, some employment floor space, and I'm rushing, hotel, parking space, 1,840 parking. They haven't thought through the transport. How are people going to go from that end of Deptford into the Shard where they're going to work? I suppose they're going to work with the Shard, aren't they? You've got to fill up the Shard with someone. But you see, here's the 1840 building gutted and restored. This is the beautiful vision from Hutchinson Whampoa. This is what your opium money gets you. I'm not against Chinese capital. I'm certainly against Chinese capitalists. But actually, surely this lovely scenario is probably not going to eventuate because the building isn't structurally sound. Or there seems to be some problem. And what we're going to get instead is just the towers. Quid pro quo. Thanks very much.
Thanks for that mighty contribution from transcontinental histories. I'm sure there are questions, and we've got 10 minutes of Q&A now. My own question would be kind of following your own. We live in an age of armchair commentators on revolutions abroad. And, we love to talk them up optimistically and misread them as long as they fit in our frameworks, and Marx seems to be an early example of that.
What was it about him or his study method that prevented him from journeying to these places?
I'm kind of being a bit facetious when I say he should have gone to the site where value was being extracted. I mean, Calcutta, first city of the empire. London was where the banks are and the warehouses were. But the value was being extracted in Calcutta, and maybe he should have gone there, and he didn't. Okay, but then he was a bankrupt, and you know, Engels was doling out the money. Engels was quite wealthy, working for Engels and Herman in Manchester, but he didn't go to Bengal. But Bengal had no shortage of Marxists eventually. Right? So it's just a little bit of a conceit to say why didn't he go there. But I do think we have to rethink our narrative of globalization, to recognise that Calcutta was the first city of the empire, not London. As for the armchair thing, I think that's a problem with the way which we've read the theoretical aspects of part of Marx, and largely ignored the journalism, the activism. He's continually interrupting his theoretical work with engagement with revolutionary movements, building the Internationale, or earlier, the June 48 revolution. He's the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung. He's helping people smuggle weapons to the comrades in Dresden. Richard Wagner, of all people, he helps facilitate getting money and for weapons to them. He's continually, he becomes famous really for his support for the communards. After the communards are viciously put down, he organises London as a kind of refugee centre in support for them. And that's what gets him noticed by the British state. He says somewhere, finally, after 20 years of being in my garret, being ignored, they noticed. And they noticed this. He wasn't even fully supportive of the communards' action. He said they were going to be crushed, and yet he got behind them. So I want to just tack back a little bit on the suggestion that he's an armchair revolution. There's activism. Yes, he also pays a lot of attention to the negotiated tactics of organisation. For example, the First Internationale, when the anarchists start to take it over, Bakunin is and his anarchist group risking exposure to a much stronger Prussian state at the time. He moves the leadership of the Internationale to New York as a strategy in internal politicking as well. I suppose he did that for an armchair. They weren't in an armchair. Interesting thing we found out just the other day from reading some biographies. We were visiting their houses. Ian Marx's house in his study on the first floor in Maitland Park, number 1 Maitland Park up there near Primrose Hill. He and Engels used to meet in their office and pace up and down. Apparently they wore a cross-like mark on the carpet. And they argued so much, stomping back and forth. Can you imagine these two old guys, about 60 at the time, grumpily marching back and forth. Not in their armchairs, nonetheless, still here in London. And they should have been in Calcutta.
Go take you and then Dusty and
I like the nice little irony. I like the nice little irony that you pointed up. That what we have here is basically in a globalised world we still have inherited wealth having a big significance on current developments. I think that's one of your basic points. You're making a link between the 19th century people and the current company.
The cultural capital and the material capital
yeah.
of the company. Yeah.
Yes, quite. What I wanted to raise with you though was this. Not always somebody who likes to sit around quoting Marx, but I will on this occasion. One of his famous sayings is, philosophers have only analysed the world, the point however is to change it.
Interpreted. Yeah.
Interpreted the world in various ways, the point however is to change it. Now I'm involved with people who are trying to stop this Convoys Wharf development. And it's a real uphill battle. It's a terrible uphill battle. And what I want to know is, how do you see the analysis that you've just presented contributing towards mobilising people to claim back what is their own space? Because what I see happening, and I intend to sort of say this when I sort of talk as well, is what we're having here is a process of a public space, in this case very much our national history, being appropriated for private purposes. how do we deal with that? That's what I think is a key thing. How does this analysis help us, help those people there?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's the right question. I don't think it's going to happen in Deptford. I wish Deptford was Gezi, right? Or Tahir Square or something, but it's not going to be. It's in the wrong part of London, isn't it?
Sorry,
But
you think that...
I wish Deptford was Gezi Park in Turkey, right? Or Tahir, or somewhere where we would mobilise around like that. But I don't think it's. But part of the context, I think, is this: that we are being sold in this country a series of sporting festivals. Right, sporting. Some of the Ashes have started today. Actually, they've begun. But we got a live feed to find out.
102 for 3.
England. Yes. I'm pleased with that. Sporting festivals. Look at the 2 Augusts. August 2011, August 2012. There was an uprising. Uprisings are defeated. Marx can help us analyse how and why.
No, but how does your analysis fit in with
I'm saying
their
that,
struggle?
Mark.
That's what
How
I
does it
want to
fit
know.
in with this particular Convoys Wharf? I think the better strategy for defeating this is pointing out how it's dysfunctional.
Sorry?
For defeating Convoy Wharf, a better strategy is pointing out how it's dysfunctional.
Oh,
This
sure,
influx of so many people into condos, they aren't going to be able to travel out of the area. We don't have the infrastructure. There isn't the, right, there are many ways, but one way in which I think there's something to be discussed here is how this capital development, which is basically a land grab, they want to sell 3,500 condos, has none of the periphery, informal sector or the other infrastructural support that will allow it to really work as a community. It's going to be plonked down like so many of these things have all over the world, and it will be. So we have to oppose it. I'm all for opposing it. I'm pretty confident that this argument of dysfunction isn't going to get past Johnson's desk. It's likely that he'll say no. But in terms of policy approval and project approval, that is on the table right now, as you must know. Right? It was 1st of July was the date you had to have objections in, and the objection is in, you can still comment on it, but you can't put in new involved in the group that's doing that.
I was involved in another group, but I know the people.
Yeah, right. So Johnson has to make a decision. But I don't think that not in my backyard is the thing we're discussing. So this is why your question is a really good one. Do we put out spot fires, or do we need a root and branch transformation of this society? And I think we saw the potential for that in August 2011. It was just 3 days. Right? In the 3rd day, people started to go to places like rich suburbs like Ealing, and then there was a massive police crush. Right? They cracked down. First of all, the police were stepping back because they're suffering from austerity as well, right? So they want support. They stepped back when it was just Lewisham, when it was these suburbs that don't really matter to the establishment so much. But when it was Ealing, they crushed it. And imagine what 3 weeks of that would do to the complacency of this society. Or 3 months. Something like what's happening in Tahir, or in Gezi, or what's happening in Oakland. Not Wall Street, because that was a little bit not in my backyard, wasn't it? Although symbolically it's good, but it needed to be decolonised. I think Oakland was more interesting. These are the scale of the transformation required, because this is big capital. This is capital drift, right? It's Chinese capital coming back to the capital to make make plunder happen again. So primitive accumulation needs to be read as something that so-called primitive accumulation, Marx called it. In fact, in German, it's Verfassung, originary accumulation. And his argument is that's ongoing, it's always ongoing. So this is a moment of plunder. The same with the other project in the East London. Capital drift is also this drift of the city towards the east, with capital to the east. What's the new development by the Docklands for the airport? We've got the company.
Albert,
Yes.
the Royals.
The unused land
Royals.
site, yeah.
The Royals.
That's now going to be developed by Chinese capital again. Chinese capital's got to go somewhere, but this is part of the analysis we need to make, rather than I don't know, let's be provocative, NIMBY campaigns. Building community and doing it in a localised way means you get picked off by the police and crushed. You need to take the struggle from Lewisham to Ealing. Oh, that might be a provocative version of it. But I think it's a great question.
I have one final question from the back, and then we'll go to break.
Just a quick one. Do you think the East India Company kind of created a blueprint for corporate imperialism, where you've got examples of, rather than countries, you've got companies who grow, take over, make alliances, go to markets, strip them of their resources and bring it back to their centre? Or is it a bit more complicated than that?
It's a good question.
Because you can have anything from the oil companies to what native Africans actually think of Chinese investment. Something is good, something realise that it's actually doing them a lot more harm.
I think not. But I think not in a way that I want to try and make confident. There's an argument by Hutnyk which says that the version of global corporate capital companies, Gordon Gekko type companies that are buying and selling off, with that scenario that we've had since the fall of sausage and three veg communism, 89 onwards or something, probably can date it a bit earlier, is similar to the kind of company that belonged before 1857 to the East India Company model. But they say that there was a period of national and government-supported capital development investment where investment and struggles against it circulated in a kind of lateral way. But now there's the global and it's a vertical version. But I find that unconvincing. And for two reasons. One, it didn't seem to play out like that when 2001 happened and the War on Terror, which is a nationally driven war, even though there are partners and so on, occurred. And then we've been picking off national states in the East as a kind of career one by one. But also, the East India Company was never just a company. Even before it was taken over by the British government, it was the British government. There was heavy Disraeli's 3-hour speech kind of illustrates it. I don't think it was ever without a national stamp of approval. Yes, seal of approval there, but the imprimatur, actually a letter of marque, effectively. These letters you used to get to allow you to be a pirate so long as you were appointed by the Queen. Effectively, they were like this. And you have to understand the East India Company's formal trade, it is wheeling and dealing, was a fraction of the wealth creation that was happening in this informal, this illicit trade, upcountry trade. Interestingly, Clive cracked down on the upcountry trade. Right? He, except for his own upcountry deals, he stopped the other officials of the East India Company doing such a. But what happened then is there became more senior management of the East India Company doing official trade. They kind of calling it that. So I think it's important to look at the similarities and the difference between capital and the intervening period and why that was the case. Because it was a super flash. Because there was a communist alternative. But I'm not a fan of Hutnyk. It's in Empire if you want to.
Okay, great.
Thanks for your question.
Thanks for your contribution. We can chat over it over the nibbles.
Right.
We can be back in this room in 10 minutes, and whoever's presenting the next session can upload your files.